So I'll try to kind of speed through this because I have a lot of slides because while I was making them, I figured out like I wanted to talk about a lot of things. So you should see these mostly as potential talking points during the Q&A session. So don't focus too much on the slides themselves. I'm going to make them available so people can go through them and all the links and all the things that I mentioned. So I'll start off briefly with theory because I think it's kind of important that when we talk about improving methods, we also talk about how we communicate what it is that we're actually discussing. So for instance, when we start to design a paper, we should make it clear what perspective we're taking from a theoretical point of view, because within deception, there are a bunch that people could use, and sometimes they don't make it explicit. They simply just infer it. So for instance, you might say, what are the source of cues that people might use? Do you believe that there is diagnosticity behind them? So are they universal? Can we use them to determine if somebody is being honest or deceptive? Or should you see them basically like the behavioral ecology view sees them as communicative signals? They might vary from time to time from in-group, out-group. So there wouldn't be any expectation of actual differences. This is why if you've seen some of my papers, I make the distinction between deception detection, which infers and assumes this type of decoder behavior where you have to detect cues, and based on this detection, you make accurate inferences. I tried to focus more on veracity judgments, which I basically say I don't think people, or at least I haven't found evidence that people can distinguish these types of cues if they do exist. So I focus more on what might be shifting their judgment, what might make them biased one way or another, what might make them more confident or another. So I tried to communicate this when I tried to set up my experiment so people don't infer one of these when I might actually belong to a different camp. So I'd say that the first thing we should do to try to improve the concept of methods and deception is be specific about what theoretical framework you're starting from. What do you consider to be indicators of deception or the things that you're trying to measure? Then what do you actually think the process that you're measuring is? Is it detection or is it judgment? How do you think accuracy and bias are going to be structured in these things? And more importantly, is what is the generalizability of your data? And what I mean by this is under what assumptions do you expect to find the current results versus in what situations do you expect them to either be counteracted by something else or nullified? So this links to Deborah Mayo's severity testing, which is not really discussed a lot in research, but I think it's kind of the future for this type of approach, trying to understand the limitations of a specific behavior. So that brings us over to methodology. So I have one on methodology, one on analyses, and then I'll speak briefly on how this works with open science and communication with practitioners. So one thing that I think is relevant to be discussed a bit more within our field is operationalization and operational definitions. So very often we just kind of use terms in our paper and our publications without really telling people what it is that we are referring to. So you might see papers that say truth detection, lie detection, but then sometimes they say deception detection. These things might mean different things. So I see some people use lie detection and deception detection interchangeably. I use deception detection as kind of the total of truth and lies. Other people might use truth detection to mean correct, truthful videos identified without correcting for bias. Other people might use it from a signal detection theory point of view, like proportional truth judgments. I have no way of knowing unless somebody specifies what it is exactly that they're trying to measure and why did they measure it in that way. Another one that I saw was discussed in like the late 80s and early 90s was the type of scales that we use to answer these questions. So now we seem to have kind of defaulted to either lie, truth, or maybe a ternary one where you have a don't know in the middle. But I think an honesty scale is also something where we should consider, especially based on the type of questions that we want to answer. So for instance, the lie and truth might force your sample to say something. So you have all the data to analyze, might match something in a, let's say, courtroom procedure event. Having a don't know will allow you to measure differences in uncertainty between conditions. So maybe you give them some sort of instructions and it makes most of them more ambivalent about the decision. So then you can capture that only if you have a third option. While in my case, I care about the variance in people's responses, how it might shift between conditions, because again, I don't think that there is a diagnosticity to be had. So I care more about capturing variance, for example, in a signal detection theory model that can capture these things. We already had a nice talk from Eric on effect sizes, so I won't spend too much time on this. The only thing that I would like to mention is that we should communicate what type of effect sizes we care about. So it was mentioned that, for example, Cohen's d comes up a lot. We should be aware of what we actually expect to find within psychology. It tends to be a Cohen's d of 0.40. But I'm always surprised that since we have lie and truth judgments, why we don't use things like odds ratios, which would be what normally economists tend to use in these types of scenarios. So then instead of reporting or even thinking about research from a Cohen's d and ANOVAs and t-test, we might look at odds ratios, which in this case, it's about like 2 times as likely in, if you're expecting a Cohen's d of 0.4. So saying, I think that if I give them training, the odds will be basically twice as high as in the condition in which they don't receive training. So if you use something like logistic regression or logit models, this might be one way to communicate it. And as you see in the little figure on the right, it's very easy to do. So there are packages or even web apps, they can easily transfer between things that you might know to effects that you might want to investigate but are not really sure. But what I think is more important is just being aware, for example, within your own research, what you tend to find. So I know that in mine, for accuracy, before you correct for bias, the lowest I found is 0.2, the highest is about 1 Cohen's d, and for truth for bias is between 0.24 and 0.72. So when I plan future research and I focus on my smallest effect size of interest, as Eric said, I know that it has to be somewhere in here in terms of what I from exploratory research might have found. So if I'm trying to do some sort of confirmatory research, I would plan for one of these. Normally I plan for like a Cohen's d of 0.4 or 0.5 if I have nothing else to kind of go on, because at least then I have some sort of sample size calculation that I can go with. And coming over to sample sizes, one thing that I think we do need to improve a bit, and this is slightly unique to our field, is that we tend to power for the wrong thing. So if you use something like G-power, the sample size it gives you is for the full interaction, not for the pairwise comparison. So, and all the studies we're doing, since we have truths and lies, it's automatically going to have an in-between element to it. And people kind of forget that. They forget that what they actually might want to test is like training versus control. So that's a t-test. You basically have a t-test, plus you need to correct for all of the multiple comparisons that you're doing. So it's something to take into account. I wrote a blog recently when I said that if you also want to power for excluding effects, like as Eric mentioned, like having a rope or using equivalence test, this might be one cutoff to you. So you need about 114 people if you're anticipating a D of 0.40. But again, cutoffs are just as a starting point for your research. But one thing that I see nobody really mentions is you might have heard that if you have a within subjects design, you need fewer participants because the data is correlated, therefore variance is going to be reduced. Yes, that is true, but in most deception studies, we actually have a negative correlation between truth and lies. It's normally 0.30. I've checked in all of my data, meaning that the estimates that something like G-power will give you are wrong by a factor of about 3. If you put in that it's a negative correlation, it will tell you that for like a Cohen's d of 0.5, so like a medium one, you need 138 people instead of the 54 that the default is. So almost 3 times as many, because we always have to think, what does our research look like, not what the defaults that these types of tools tend to use. I'm not going to spend time on observational research. I think that that's very important, but people should know that it's a completely different animal that you have to approach differently. You have to have causal models that predict what you think is going on, and you should use p-values because they don't make any sense in observational data. Maybe we can talk about that during the Q&A session. Okay, so now over to the statistical analysis things. Those that have seen my Decepticon talk, will be familiar with some of the things that I'll be presenting, but hopefully there'll be some new stuff in here as well. So one thing that we should be aware of is the reality of deception research. Very often we don't have nice big experiments. We might have convenience samples because we're using police officers like I did in the study, and I could only record so many. So then you're kind of stuck saying, well, my power analysis said we need this many people. I could only collect this many. Can I still publish or do I scrap the data? I think given the importance of the research that we're conducting, we should always publish our work or at least make it available. So if you happen to have an underpowered sample because something happened and you couldn't collect more data, there are ways around this. So you can use estimation statistics instead of hypothesis testing. You can use Bayesian statistics to see how much uncertainty there is in your data. Same with if you have a single individual. So you can do what is called single case experimental research. So you have only, let's say, one investigator, one brilliant psychopath that you're trying to investigate. There are methods to analyze that data. It's different from the group, so average groups research, but it is possible and it is doable. I did it in one of my studies in a supplemental material because I had one police investigator and I was curious if he had any reliable effects. One thing we should also note is in our field, there's a lot more variability than you see in other social psych. So we should have designs to check the assumptions like equal variance. I'll come back to that in a second, and make sure that the data we collect can actually test these types of approaches. Not to mention that if you anticipate that, let's say, a training program is going to produce more variability in people's responses, that's going to affect your power analysis, the effect sizes you calculate, and even how you interpret the data, because you can't assume everything is going to be nice. And as Tim mentioned, we also have to start thinking about the types of videos that we use and how many we use, because very often you have one data set that only you have, nobody else has, and you keep working on that one. I think the future is that we have to be building databases that are available to everybody here to be able to see how their approaches compare, how we're doing these types of studies. Like the Miami deception database is absolutely fantastic, but I worry that everybody's just going to default to using that one if they don't have their own. So maybe we can do some sort of concerted effort to build these things together. I mentioned unequal variance. This is a nice study by Nahari in 2019 that estimated what the data looks like in various deception studies. The paper has more than this, but what I would like to draw your attention to is the fact that none of these seem to be normally distributed or have equal variance. But this is exactly what we tend to assume every time you power for a t-test or an ANOVA. So that's something that we should take into account. There have been some people that have suggested maybe we report other statistics. As you see on the slides, I have some reservations about that, but it's still a good idea. And I think that we should be plotting our results every time we have them, so people understand exactly what it is that is going on, and it also allows us to build better research in the future. Eric mentions testing for no effects. I think this is very important and people should take it into account. There are ways to make sure that your studies can tell no effects. And I think this is super important in deception, because in my studies, I always anticipate that there's not going to be an effect of accuracy, because I don't think people can be more accurate based on nonverbal cues. So I have to design my studies where I can reject the fact that there is nothing actually going on versus there is something going on. So there are multiple approaches that we can take, both frequentist and Bayesian. This is part of what I mentioned during my Decepticon talk. So we should start building better models. So for example, if you have bounded data, because we keep treating our data as percentages, you can't just use the normal regression, because that's likely to estimate values that don't exist and create differences that would not be in your data if you used something like an ordered beta regression, which nowadays is very easy to use. I've linked here some packages that can do this for you with the data you have pretty easily. The same with people tend to treat Likert data as if it's normally distributed. It's not. And it's easy to analyze using cumulative models, especially if you have like confidence or one of those honesty scales that I mentioned earlier. Okay, breezing through this. As I said, if we can streamline the type of research that we publish, it's better. So very often you see what you, on the left, you have basically 4 analyses that cover the exact same data. You have accuracy, then you have to split it with bias, then you have to split it if you do some signal detection theory and the bias in that one. So all of those 4, not only do they have their own problems, and you can see the links that I provided to a talk that I gave on this, you can summarize all of that within a nice single probit model that approximates to a signal detection theory model anyway, and captures all of the variability in your data. And now I have a script that kind of is a little tutorial for how to plug in your own data and have this depending on the different type of design. So I don't just have a simple design, I also have more complicated designs, because I know that that's what people might actually be using in their own research. And we should be building towards mixed effects models all the time, because I think that in our field, there's so much variability between senders. So the different videos that we have are so extreme that we shouldn't just see it as trial 1, 2, and 3, the same way as the people making the decisions to decode. So our judges are probably very varied between them, and they have their own biases. So if we can capture that, it's probably for the best. Okay, slightly on transparency and translatability, and then I'll finish on the open stuff. I think to make it easier for practitioners and non-researchers, because I know that there's some in the room right now, we have to start thinking how we communicate this, because people care about deception research. You probably found it when you're applying for grants, but also in terms of people asking you at parties, how can I detect if somebody's lying? So people care. So because of that, we should be communicating all of this information in a way that is easy for people to understand. So for example, you might want to always plot your data so people know exactly how much overlap there is between multiple conditions or how much variance you're explaining. But you might also change something from, instead of just reporting p-values and Cohen's d, which people that are not researchers have no idea what it is, even researchers might not. You might want to report something like probability of superiority or number needed to treat. So you might say something like a randomly chosen person from the training condition is 62% more likely to be better at detecting deception than somebody from the control condition. Easy to understand. It's exactly the same as above. It's just communicating in a different metric. And I provided an example from one of my papers when I did something like this. So this might be easier for people to read a deception paper and know what it is that's going on. Okay, so that was on this. And finally, how should we do this in an open science field? I think we should focus on reproducibility, openness, interpretability, and transparency. So that means we start to share our code for how we analyze the data. We share the data as well, because it's sometimes very difficult to collect deception data. We try to share our videos, and when we report our findings, we use, as I mentioned, estimation language. We plot our data, and we try to report effect sizes in a way that is actually interpretable to people. And I have a workflow here on how to do so, from like how do you start the project all the way to the bottom, but I'll skip that for now. And here I provide some examples of how to pre-register these types of studies in deception, like what information you need to report, and then how to pre-print the final result before you submit it for publication. That's it. I sped through that. Hopefully there's some talking points there for later, and I look forward to your questions.